This afternoon, I am in Cincinnati, enjoying the warm weather of early fall. And even though I drafted this some weeks ago, that's exactly what we've got out there. And I'm speaking with Kenneth J Hirsh, who is the director of the Law Library and Information Technology and professor of practice at the University of Cincinnati. Ken, as is our custom, beginning these, we'd like to find out a little bit about you as a person other than just a law librarian. Tell us a little bit about that.
Thank you, Pat, and thank you for taking the time to come do this with me. I started out in Brooklyn, New York. My parents had both grown up there, and I was their second son. Mm-hmm. And we very briefly moved then to Manchester, New Hampshire, long enough for my younger sister to be born. Mm-hmm. And moved back to Brooklyn for a very short time, and then we moved down to South Florida, settling ultimately in Hialeah, Florida, which is in Miami-Dade County, and through much of the last century was best known for being the home of the thoroughbred racing and the beautiful flamingos at Hialeah Park. And through when we first moved there, we were part of a great migration of people from the Northeast, like New York, Boston, Philadelphia, down to South Florida. And then beginning in the early 60s, after Castro had come to power, we started having an influx of Cuban refugees. And so you could really say that by the middle 60s, Miami was really an area filled with refugees, either from the Northeast, from the South in Cuba, or just to the east from people who were trying to escape the poverty and the political conditions in Haiti. Mm-hmm. And then growing up through, next I need to note that when I was in junior high in 7th grade, my father died of a heart attack, which of course was a very traumatic experience for all of us, the three children and my mom.
Probably a real game changer.
Yeah, definitely. And from that point, I looked a whole lot to my older brother for guidance as to how to grow up as a boy and then as a man. Through middle school and high school, I made a lot of friends, some very close, and some of whom I still keep in touch with after more than 50 years. Mm-hmm. I went to school at the University of Miami, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. And I went up to Gainesville for law school, where I met my wife Lisa when I was a 1L. And we got married in August, right before I started my 2L year. Mm-hmm. And we moved around primarily the East Coast, and then started a family. And we have 2 adult girls, or I should say women. And now an adult.
You'd better say women.
I should say 3 children, all adults. But when they started out, they were 2 girls and a boy.
Uh-huh. When they were little and
now they're quite grown, and in fact, our older daughter is going to give birth to our first grandchild within a couple of weeks.
Well, congratulations!
And thank you very much. She's expecting a son,
mm-hmm.
And our daughters have lived in Durham even since we moved from Durham about 8 years ago, and our son moved back there a few weeks ago. So Lisa and I are ultimately hoping to get back to living in the Raleigh-Durham area.
Uh-huh. Well, you never know. There are several law schools. There are 3.
There are.
And maybe one of them will come open at the right time, and you
could
can be attracted.
We'll just keep our fingers crossed.
Absolutely. Well, sort of to kind of supplement your story, could you tell us but still stick with the personal side,
mm-hmm.
Could you tell us if you have any particular hobbies or other special passions?
Well, when I was growing up, I loved to go fishing. This was especially true when my father was alive, but even for some time afterwards, saltwater fishing on either piers in the Miami area, mm-hmm. occasionally small boats, very occasionally a party boat. But I pretty much stopped doing that after our first daughter was born. It just didn't interest me so much, and it was hard to arrange the time to do it. I've always been very interested in trivia. When I was in high school, I participated in the high school version of College Bowl, which in Miami-Dade County, then as it was known, Dade County, was called Brain Brawl. And it has been my lifelong dream, or at least my dream since late junior high, to be on Jeopardy! And I achieved that dream back in August when I was in Culver City appearing as a contestant on Jeopardy, and that program will air on October 27th.
And I'm under orders to pry out of you, if
Yes,
possible,
I'm
how
sure
you
Michael
did. But
Whiteman told you this.
But
to do
I
this.
said I would probably end up in jail for
Well,
stealing trade secrets.
Well,
or
you wouldn't end
something.
up in jail.
Or maybe
but
you
would. You'd probably be.
Telecom.
I would suspect you would be committing tortious interference with a contract.
That's what it is. Yes, I think I'm familiar with that one, but fortunately not because I've done it.
No.
I've heard about it.
Right, but we do, in fact, the Jeopardy contestants sign a 12-page release form, which does include a non-disclosure agreement. So, although I can tell you what a wonderful time I had, and how
all you
terrific
can
I thought
tell.
Alex and Johnny Gilbert and all the crew was, I can't tell you anything about the game itself until
Yeah.
after it is aired.
Well, I understand that. I mean, these shows would not be able to track the audiences they have
Exactly.
if people were leaking on social media or wherever the results before it got on the air.
Indeed.
Understandable.
In addition to trivia, I'm semi-famous in AALL for leading a karaoke party every year at the annual meeting. And I'm not a great singer, but I really enjoy singing a lot, and a karaoke bar is the right setting because the audience is relaxed, certainly loose enough that they don't hold anything against you, really. And the first time I did karaoke was actually at a Duke University staff Christmas party in 1992,
Uh-huh.
when I did a horrible job of Mel Torme's The Christmas Song. So I don't include that in my repertoire anymore.
Well, at least you weren't on national television trying to sing the Star Spangled
Yes,
Banner.
that would be a horrible
That's a tough
mistake.
one to sing. And-
Yes. I'll leave that to the real singers.
Uh-huh. Well, sort of starting to refocus back on you as a law librarian and director and all that. Could you tell us, you mentioned a couple of degrees, could we be more specific? You have 3.
Sure.
And what they are? And
Sure. When I started out, from the time I was a very young child, I thought I would become an ichthyologist, which is a fish scientist.
Uh-huh.
And I was planning on going to the University of Miami, which has if I get the name right, the Rosenstiel Institute of Marine and Atmospheric Science, which would have been the perfect setting. So after graduation from Hialeah High, before college though, in late junior high and more so in high school, I got hooked on watching Perry Mason episodes, and then I also got involved in some local politics, including helping lead a recall campaign for some of our city councilmen, which ultimately was a failed campaign. But that made me
I hope it shook them up and maybe they straightened them out
tiny
a
bit, but
Yeah.
never straightened them out.
No.
Also, when my mother had put our house on the market and decided she had set what I would call seller's remorse at that point, and I told her, I read the contract and I thought I found a loophole for her, so she went to see an attorney, and I don't know that he found her that loophole, so I can't claim the credit. But he was able to get her out of the contract, and we kept the house. So at that point on, I wanted to become an attorney. So when I got to the University of Miami, though, I still started out majoring in biology. And after my first year of science courses, I realized that the intensity and difficulty level of the college science courses was much harder than anything I had tried in high school, and I decided I would find a shortcut to get to law school, so I changed to political science, where I studied especially local government politics and local government management. And by changing my major and by the benefit of the CLEP program, I got about a semester and a half, or almost a year's worth of credits out of CLEP, so I was able to get my undergraduate degree in 3 years.
Mhm.
From then I went straight to Gainesville to get my JD at the University of Florida, and that's where I met the lovely woman who would become my wife, Lisa Lancaster, was her name at that time.
Mhm.
And we were married in August, right before I started my 2L year, and I kept interrupting wherever we were, and starting then and continuing for the first 20-odd years of our marriage. I kept interrupting her education. She was very kind to help support me through law school. And then when we had children, she took on the joyful, but still a burden in terms of time, taking care of our children. I mean, not that I wasn't an involved father, but still I was attempting to earn money, and she was very kindly taking care of the home front most of the time. Although there were times around the time Kimberly was born, and again later when Lisa also worked outside of the home to help make ends meet. So from there, I tried to, after getting the JD, I did not finish well in my class, and I had trouble finding gainful legal employment. So I started out working for the Social Security Administration as a claims representative trainee. That lasted about 8 months. Then I went up to Washington. So Lisa and I moved up to Washington, D.C., Northern Virginia, which at the time is where her parents lived. And I worked for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for not quite a year and a half.
And getting back to being a fish scientist.
Yes, well, instead of a fish scientist, a marine life and endangered species supporter from the legal side.
Uh-huh.
The two main things I did were, the first one was we did civil penalty proceedings against people who generally imported, often innocently, contraband in the United States. So any article that was made from the parts of something listed as an endangered species would have been prohibited.
Mm-hmm.
And 9 times out of 10, they would be something like a comb made from a turtle shell, a hawksbill turtle shell. And so we basically offered them, you forfeit this item, there's no further penalty, and most of the time people forfeited items.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing I was involved in was drafting regulations, and one special project that has always been dear to my heart is manatee protection.
Mm-hmm.
And many people know them better as sea cows. And they're a marine mammal that frequents both inland waters, including some of the rivers, and the coastal areas in Florida. And the number one cause of mortality for them is collision with motorboats, and especially motorboat propellers. So we and the Florida Freshwater Game and Fish Commission, or Game and Freshwater Fish Commission, were more so the feds at that point were looking at ways to protect manatees. So I drafted regulations that created manatee protection areas and low speed zones so that boats could either be prohibited from or be required to keep a no wake speed to lessen the likelihood of collision with manatees. And I'm proud to say that regulation is still on the books. For the legal researchers among you, you can find it beginning at 50 CFR 17.100. But after a blizzard in the Washington, D.C. area on Washington's Day weekend, between that, 22 inches in 24 hours.
I was there. I remembered that. And yes, that was a more than usual type of storm for that area.
And then shortly thereafter, I had a trip down to Brunswick, Georgia, which is where FLETC Glencoe is located. That's the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, Glynn County. And that was in late March, early April, when I did a training session for agents on the Endangered Species Act. And the reacquaintance with Florida, I flew into Jacksonville and drove up to Brunswick, made me decide very strongly to try to get back to the Southland. So in September of that year, we moved back to Daytona Beach, where I took a job directing the Senior Citizens Unit of Central Florida Legal Services, which was funded primarily by the Legal Services Corporation. And from there, while we were shortly after leaving there, or shortly before leaving there, in either case, our elder daughter Kimberly was born. I then took a job with a private legal services clinic in Melbourne, Florida. I'm sorry, not Melbourne, in the Orlando area. And from there, I took a job with one in Melbourne, Florida. And I should say that the area, the clinic itself had an office in Maitland or Apopka or Orlando, I don't remember which, but the clinic I worked on was actually in Ormond Beach, which was in Volusia County, which is also, so that was just north of Daytona Beach. Then we moved to Melbourne for me to work for another legal clinic. And then I went on my own as a solo practitioner for about 4 years. And at that point, during that time, our younger daughter, Mary Elizabeth, was born. And ultimately, we came to the realization that I was not a rainmaker and would not survive financially as an attorney, and also got quite frustrated when my some of my clients would listen to me for 20 minutes or 30 minutes and then go do the exact opposite of what I had counseled them to do.
I imagine a lot of clients are notorious for that, following the advice of their lawyers, or if they're patients, their doctors.
Yes. So Lisa and I huddled and tried to figure out what I could do that I would likely be good at and would still take advantage of my legal education background, and we concluded law librarianship would be a good thing to try. Mm-hmm. So we found, we looked at where there were highly rated law libraries or library information schools, and also we wanted to give Lisa yet another stab at completing her bachelor's degree. She had been able to get her associate's degree while we lived in Melbourne, mm-hmm. and we decided to go to Florida State. So we took our daughters with us, who were then roughly 6 and 2, and headed up to Tallahassee, and I found that library school was the perfect place for me. I loved the people there. I loved what we were studying. Lisa was resuming her studies. The girls were quite popular when we brought them into the lounge area of the library school, where you might expect charming young girls would captivate all the college-age students who were there.
Well, of course.
And some of the faculty as well. And I made some good friends there, worked 3 jobs in that year. One job as a research assistant for a faculty member, mm-hmm. one job working as a reference librarian at the FSU Law School, primarily on weekends, and one job as a lab assistant in the FSU Library School Computer Lab. Mm-hmm. At the time it was called the School of Library and Information Studies. I think now it is the School of Information within the College of Communication and Information. So I think they call it CCI now.
Okay.
And I finished a year counting the summer, and Lisa was not yet done. And during the time we were there, I was working those 3 jobs, plus back then students could qualify for food stamps, so we were also relying on food stamps. And Lisa was no slacker. She was going to school and taking care of the girls. Mm-hmm. And so we were both very busy, but we figured out a way to make it work. And after a year, I was anxious to be gainfully employed, so I was on the market, and I had the great pleasure one Saturday while I was sitting at the reference desk at FSU to get calls within 15 minutes from both Duke and the University of Miami, who were both looking for a reference librarian.
Somebody was putting the word out,
yes.
I think.
And I think it was, if I'm right, the first call came from Duke. That was Claire Germain. And I believe the second call from Miami came from the late Warren Rosemarin. Uh-huh. And since Lisa had become familiar with the Miami area from our visits, and she thought it was just a little too crowded and cramped, and she had no desire to drive on the roads, we were more interested in Duke and Durham. Mm-hmm. And as it turned out, I was offered that job after the interview, and I began that fall working as a reference librarian at Duke, and with the special task also of not only providing reference service, but setting up their first local area network for student use.
Well, I think your director at that point must have been Dick Danner.
Our director was Dick Danner, and at that point I reported directly to Claire,
okay,
who was supervised all the reference librarians. And then I think a year or 2 later, Janet Cinder, who up until that time had been, I think, senior reference librarian, became the head of reference, and then I reported to Janet. Mm-hmm. And then after about 4 years, I thought that the computing needs really needed a full-time person in charge of it, and I made a proposal to create what I believe was one of the first computing services operations in a law school, and that was accepted, and I became the manager of that. Mm-hmm. And at that point, Dick became my supervisor.
Yeah, he was in the forefront of the movement by law librarians, yes, to become more involved with the technology.
Yes, I think Dick very early on saw that technology was important. First of all, to libraries, it should have been obvious to many, because computer-assisted legal research was coming into its own at that time. Folks who have been around will remember the red Lexus Ubic terminals.
Yeah,
And
with the chiclet keys.
yes, and the early Walt computers, and the sound of modems dialing out. But I think Dick also saw that computing would be more necessary in all law school operations, not just within the library. And at that time at Duke, for example, I'll go back a little bit in my technology history. I'd always been somewhat fascinated with technology when I went to the 1964 World's Fair. And by the way, for those of you who are too young and want to get a flavor for the 1964 World's Fair, watch the Disney movie Tomorrowland that was released last year with George Clooney, among others, in it. The first few minutes of it, they have, from my point of view, recreated a chunk of the 1964 World's Fair to the point where I cried while I was watching that part of the movie. And but that was the first place I got to experience the touch-tone phone, among other technologies. Was at the 64 World's Fair at the AT&T Pavilion. So flashing back forward to library school, well, even before library school, when I worked at Fish and Wildlife, we were using mag cards, electric typewriters to generate our documents, and I became familiar with how those worked. Then, as I was leaving, they got an Olivetti word processing system that I didn't get involved in.
You didn't have to pay for it either.
No,
They were pretty pricey in those days.
So, but then at Duke, when I got there, they were using an NBI dedicated word processing system, and then we moved to using WordPerfect, which I become familiar with WordPerfect 4 in library school, and then when I was working at Duke, we moved up to WordPerfect 5.1, and then unfortunately the people in Orem, Utah didn't see how important it was for them to develop a Windows platform, so eventually they were left behind. And so for most of the rest of my time at Duke, I developed their computing operations. Some of the things we did were not long after we all became aware of Mr. Berners-Lee, great invention of the World Wide Web. We started at the Duke website, which I think you can probably find in the Internet Archive if you're really interested in looking at it. And we developed internet email early on during my time there. We offered that to our students and faculty. And in fact, that was the subject of an article I wrote, which we'll talk about in a little while. And then about 10 or 11 years ago, Wayne Miller and we brought Wayne Miller on at that time as our educational technologist. He's now their, I believe, assistant dean for academic technologies. We developed a course together on teaching technology to law students. And so we taught, I'm pretty sure, the very first instance of that in 2006. And the goal was to familiarize students with the basics of what they ought to know, so that when they're an attorney, they can talk intelligently and deal intelligently with technology. So we foresaw the one, I believe is Rule 1.6 comment in the ABA Model Code of Professional Conduct that talks about the need to keep abreast of technology.
Mm-hmm.
And from Duke, about 8 years ago, almost exactly, I was offered the position here, and came to realize that it was time to move on from Duke.
You were there, what, about 19
and a half years, yeah.
Yeah.
And I got a rocking chair.
They gave you a chaired position.
Yes, that's my chair position. I didn't quite have to make the 20 or 25 year mark to get my rocking chair. I was very happy about that. That's sitting in my house.
So that's a tradition there.
Yes, for a long time, employees. And I've been the director here since February of 2009.
Okay. Well, as you've worked your way up, I mean, you spent a good part of your early years at one institution.
Yes.
Almost 20. And I'm assuming you've acquired some mentors along the way, maybe there and elsewhere.
Yes.
Can you share before we move on?
Certainly, Dick has been a mentor, and one of the maxims that Dick taught me is tell everyone everything, and that's meant in terms of helping them get through their day and getting their work done. So if you know something that impacts them, with very rare exception, you should share that with them, and I try to honor that maxim. Another person I didn't see often, but he left a good impression on me, was the late Albert Brecht of University of Southern
He
California.
was a pretty gifted librarian.
Yes, he
He
was.
worked with us when I was in Houston. He was actually a law student, and even early on, he stood out in
Yes.
many ways from the others.
And one of the things I did for him and Darren Fox, who was working for him at that point, was a consult.
Mhm.
But Albert introduced me to some other people in the association, and those are there are others I've met along the way, but I'm having trouble thinking of them at the moment, and I don't recall whether I wrote anyone else's name down.
Senior moment, I didn't see any.
Yeah. But there are others, and I apologize for omitting you from my discussion, because I know I could not get where I am today without lots of
Start
them.
naming names, and it's always so easy to leave somebody off, and then in retrospect, you get embarrassed that you did.
The people whom I admired early on and hoped to emulate, people who were in AAL leadership roles. So, for example, back in SEAL met in Asheville, while my wife was pregnant with our son, and this was in the spring of 1994, and I remember I was impressed with the people who were around me, because I was sitting at a table with Kay Todd and Carol Billingsley and I think Dick Danner and Jim Heller, and so I said, gee, I hope I can
Just
do
a
the kind
few
of
luminaries in
stuff.
our
I
field
hope I
there,
can do
Ken.
I hope I can do the kind of stuff they're doing in 10 or 20 years.
Yes, well, it comes if you're good, and he did with you, so here you are.
Thank you.
Now, before we moved from Duke, or you did, you were doing some formal teaching there.
Yes, I
talk
taught
about
legal
that?
research while I was a reference librarian, and so after about 4 years, when I took on starting computing services full time, I stopped teaching for 5 or 6 years, and then when I resumed teaching was the fall of 2001, and I had a class the morning of September 11th, and in fact, I had been keeping CNN on my website every morning just to keep up with the news, and I was one of the first people in law school who saw the horrific video, and I sent an email out to the school to let everyone know what was going on.
Oh.
But then an hour later I had a class scheduled, and emotionally nobody wanted to really take that class, but when you're teaching legal research as part of research and writing, if you miss a shot at teaching, you don't know when you're going to get to try it again. So the students and I somehow powered through that morning.
Well, we didn't have, being at a law school in Washington, D.C. that morning, we didn't have the option
No,
of
you
figuring
didn't.
out. They just closed everything.
Oh yeah.
Government shut down. I mean, it was chaos.
Yes,
I mean,
can
people
only
were
imagine.
trying to figure out how to get home, and all the roads that reversed were still reversed to bring people into downtown Washington. The metro was not set up to take people out. They figured it all out. I had a colleague, one of our reference librarians' wife, walked from the Department of Justice about 5 or 6 miles out to our campus
Oh wow.
with some friends, because it was faster than the gridlock on the
Oh, yeah.
streets trying to get through. Oh yeah, so you taught class that morning.
Yeah.
Oh, that must have been a wild experience.
Yeah. Well, it was mostly it was just trying to concentrate on the subject at hand, which I'm sure was either cases or citators at that point, and not be distracted. But the students were gracious and let me do it. Then Wayne so I resumed teaching legal research on and off for a couple of years, and then Wayne and I started preparing for the technology class by first inviting in guest speakers at basically brown bag lunches for a year. And then we wrote an article that was published in, of all places, the William and Mary Bill of Rights Journal, where we set out our theory of why and how you should teach this class. And then, as I said, I think in the spring of 2006 we taught it for the first time. And it was taught as a seminar and had pretty good size enrollment. And I brought that class here, basically.
Mm-hmm. Well, while you were at Duke, you had the opportunity to work under somebody I have always thought of as a gifted colleague, and that's Dick Danner.
Yes.
Do you want to say anything more about him?
Well, Dick was in some senses amazing to watch because, first of all, and the whole time I was there, whoever the dean was, very much respected Dick and considered him to be a very important member of the administration and would seek advice. He's also, anybody who knows him knows he's an incredibly prolific writer in our field.
Yes.
If he doesn't publish 2 articles a year, I'd be surprised. And he instilled in me, and I believe my colleagues, whom at that time included Janet Cinder and Mark Bernstein, who've gone on to be directors, and others who've gone, and Claire Germain, of course. Lauren Collins was at Duke while I was there. Mike Shirazi was my immediate predecessor as a reference librarian at Duke. So a lot of people under Duke have gone on to leadership positions at their institutions and in the association. And I think a lot of that rubs off from Dick, whether it's intentional or unintentional. I think it's both.
Probably you're right. It would do both, because he's had such success with people like yourselves, all of you.
And but one thing I clearly got from him was, but first of all, the opportunity to network with others, because Dick would invite people in, and he would also encourage our attendance at meetings. But by watching him as a role model, which was unique in a particular way for me. When I was at library school, the now late Bill Summers was our dean, and that year he was president of the American Library Association. And then when I arrived at Duke, Dick was president of AALL, so I got to go from learning to be a librarian under one National Association president to being my first librarian job with another librarian association as a president.
Well, Dick had served the association in other ways, obviously, up and before he
Yes, he
became
was
president
editor of LLJ for many
about
years.
10 years, I think, or more, yeah. And, when you talk about his own writing, to have an editor of that quality and was
Yes.
well worth it. And his successor, I think immediately maybe was Frank
And
Kodak.
then Janet.
Yeah, and then Janet Cinder. Yeah, so it's staying in the group very nicely.
And I got kind of an inkling of the editorial process because while Dick was editor, the editorial offices were within the law library, and there were 2 full-time, or at least a full and half-time, and I think 2 full-time staff members, Debbie Kaufman, and I'm not remembering, I think Joyce's last name, if I'm remembering her first name right, but they were both quite good at what they did as well.
Well, it depends on having a lot of very talented people within your reach, you would say, when you need these help.
Definitely.
Yeah, it's been described as hiring people who are smarter than you are, if possible. Yeah. Well, you left Duke in about 2009, after almost 20 years, and came here to Cincinnati, and the University of Cincinnati. You want to talk about your work here as the head of the library, director, and also some of what you've done? Yes,
and I had a couple of very early successes we were just talking about hiring good people. I was able to hire 2 extremely good people. Susan Boland, who's our associate director for Public and Research Services, and Shannon Kamen, who was both an academic and a firm law librarian, and together with the terrific people who are already here, including John Hopkins, our associate head of IT, who is retiring at the end of this week. All I really needed to do was to give them basically permission and whatever resources they needed to deliver what everybody around here wanted. And so my main goal was to set an atmosphere where they could do what they felt they had to do to get their jobs done. And I think we've been pretty successful at that. In terms of some particular accomplishments, we brought on board a B-Press institutional repository. I was an early signer of the Durham Statement that deals with trying to encourage open access to law school journals. We revised the Security Lawyers Desk Book website, although it still needs a little bit more work because it's hard to keep that up to date. But that's a partnership we have now with the Legal Information Institute at Cornell, where we point from our tables of contents directly to the federal regulations and the copies of the statutes that they maintain access to. And they actually consulted with GPO in some of the developments in putting things into FedSys and to get better, more current coverage in CFR, for example. But that website, when we look at the statistics, is used both by securities practitioners and many of the staff of the Securities and Exchange Commission on a day-to-day basis.
Sounds like a very useful resource
It
for
is indeed.
everybody to have access to.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. Now here at Cincinnati, you also continued your teaching role. as a
Yes,
faculty member.
and primarily, well, I shouldn't say primarily, but two classes. First, with Shannon, I brought the Introduction to Legal Technology or Technology and Legal Practice course, and I think this is either the fourth or fifth year we've been teaching that. And by shifting to fall from spring, we were able to get our enrollment up to a full-size class of 14 or 15. And we concentrate on the ethical implications of technology, and this is also a topic I've taught a couple of CLEs on. But we give them hands-on experience in, so for example, this week we're using Clio Cloud, and they're running through exercises so they can get a better a good handle, if they haven't already had a handle in their summer practices, summer associate practice, on how to use a case management system. They will be giving us a final presentation where they're either presenting a paper or they're setting up a website for a pretend law firm or a social media presence. They are also learning about research that would be especially beneficial if you're in solo practice, so you had to research individuals, your clients or potential clients. And most of the evaluations and the folks who come back and talk to us say it's a very worthwhile class. Also, along with Susan Boland and one of our other reference librarians, our electronic resources librarian, Ron Jones, we teach the advanced legal research class, which is through Susan's design primarily a flipped classroom where we have them do hands-on work during the class with us standing by. Is what some folks in the vernacular these days call the guide on the side. But they do a lot of their work out of class, and then we're in class. And then they were already doing it in that class, but I was before I got here. Ron and his predecessor, Virginia Thomas, were doing is having a Jeopardy based review at the end of the class, and so we carried on that as well, which tied in neatly. So in that situation, I get to host the Jeopardy session rather than being a contestant on it. But I actually bought for us the official classroom version of it, so we don't have to mess with PowerPoints. Instead, we actually have the clickers, or as they say, the signaling device, and at the very beginning, Alex Trebek's voice introducing the game.
It all sounds rather interesting and innovative in its own right.
And it's a real fun way to end the course.
Yeah. Well, I sort of don't know how you found the time for all the stuff you do, but it also includes a particularly extensive and distinguished record of professional service.
And I could not find the time without my wife being very generous, including allowing me to do all the travel that's required in doing that service.
I made a few notes sort of in anticipation of this part about some of the things that you've been doing. You were chair of the Computing Services Special Interest section of AELL. Somehow that doesn't totally surprise me, given your track record and interests. You've been on chairs and members of other AELL committees over the years. President of the Southeastern chapter of AELL, which has always been perceived by those of us who weren't part of it as extremely innovative and interesting in the kind of programs and
yes, they do
things
put
you
on
did.
excellent programming.
And of course, you were 3 years on the AELL's executive board, having just, I think this
That's
about
right.
2
Just
months
stepped
ago,
down.
we're doing this interview in September of 2016. You just ended your term in
Yeah.
July. Yeah.
Yes, so I know in November I'll have some more time to work on other projects.
Well, you never know. Well, you've done other things though. You've been involved with AllNet, Center for Computer Assisted Legal Instruction. You were a board member. You've had several recognitions already in your career,
Yes.
although I guess one doesn't have to get old to get recognized for good work. Yeah, you have a special award you got last year from SEAL for service. A couple of years before that, in 2013, you got the Fast Case 50 recognition of one of the law's innovators, techies, visionaries, and leaders. I think I've described that the way I like it described.
Yes, that's what they call it.
Yes. And I think most significant was the naming of AALL's Computing Services SIS Distinguished Service Award for you, and you were the inaugural recipient of that award.
Yes, and I was very honored to be so.
You want to talk about some of the professional service and why you do it?
Well,
that sort of
mostly
thing?
I do it because I enjoy it, because there's few and little in life I do that I don't enjoy. I mean, there are obligations, but I don't view any of that as strictly obligation. Although I do believe that as professionals we have an obligation to serve our association, serve our profession, to both to advance the aims of the profession, but also to help those who are in the profession.
Mhm.
But I enjoy taking whatever talents and skills I might have and applying them to some kind of end where something ends up being better than it was before. Starting with computing services was my natural place, as well as the academic section, although I haven't devoted as much effort into that in AALL and in Cali. That's a place where people involved in computing and law schools gravitate to, and I was very happy to serve on the board for 12 years and help steer it along with our terrific executive director, John Mayer. But mostly I enjoy the work, and much of the time the work is its own reward, but what's especially rewarding is getting to meet and work with people you work with when you do these things. I've made so many friends in doing that work, people I rely on now, some of whom I've had the benefit, the honor of, as one of the things that happens fairly often when you're the director of an academic law library is people who are going for tenure or promotions need to have outside reviewers, and I've now, since I've been here, probably served on about eight of those.
Yeah.
And
Word gets around who is knowledgeable and will do the work and write the review.
And when someone gives you an award, or especially if someone names an award after you, that's gravy on top of the entree of being able to provide the service. It's certainly something I have to say I'm very happy to get an award. But, recognition is always a treat, and there's no way I would deny
I'm not going to
enjoying
take
that.
issue with that at all. It's deserved in your case.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm sure. Earlier you mentioned or alluded to the fact that you did some consulting work
Yes.
with the late Albert Brecht
Yes.
at the University of California,
Yes.
Southern California.
Yes, that was in the early 90s.
Yeah.
They were looking at, I think they were either their local area network or some other deployment of, for computing services. And at that time, we were running what I call the late lamented to me Novell NetWare operating system. In fact, I used to crib a line from the bumper sticker that NRA members often display and say they will take Novell NetWare from my cold dead hands. Well, eventually Microsoft made it so they were able to take Novell NetWare away. But I had, over the course of setting up our LAN, become quite, I can't say I was an expert, but in the legal community, I think the people who dealt with NetWare the most were Elmer Masters, who at that time was at Cornell, and me. And Elmer now works for Cali. And so I consulted with Darren, who was setting up USC's computing services on NetWare servers, and which at that point I think we were all recommending compact servers, for example. That's how long ago this was. But so that's mostly what I did for them. About 10 or 11 years ago, I was part of a campus IT consult for Washington and Lee.
Okay.
And
just on the other side of the mountains.
Yes.
Here, I drove it last night.
yes,
When I say just, it did take us several hours.
yes, and at the end of that trip, I was picking up my daughter from Appalachian State in Boone, North Carolina, so I got to see the Roanoke Valley quite nicely. But the trip took a couple hours longer than I anticipated. That was before I was really paying attention much to Google Maps. But that was a three-person panel. That was me and the CIO from the University of Richmond and a senior technology person from Georgetown, whose names I don't remember. And we consulted at the entire campus, and my focus was especially on the law school. And what I remember most about that trip, though, was the three of us went to the Stonewall Jackson Memorial Cemetery at night so we could find Stonewall Jackson's grave, and there are many other well-known Southerners and heroes to the Confederacy buried there as well, but we did find his grave. And then
I understand there's a horse buried there too somewhere.
yes, I think it's
Robert E. Lee's.
well, no, I think his horse. I'm trying to. I may not
Maybe
get
I
this
have
right.
it wrong.
Whether it's buried in that cemetery or whether it's at VMI. I think he and his horse are at VMI, but I could be wrong.
Maybe you're right.
But they're so
Somebody's
close
horse
to each
is
other.
there.
VMI is virtually across the street from the cemetery, so I may not be getting it right.
Yeah.
So we'll all look at Wikipedia after this entry. I actually did make sure to look at Wikipedia yesterday to make sure I had the name of the cemetery right.
Well, we had a student, actually it wasn't a student, he was a college graduate who worked in my library when I was first at American, who had done his college work at in Lexington, Virginia, at William and Mary. At Washington and Lee. And while he was a student, this ceremony of burying this horse, his remains occurred. Yeah, because he told us about it at some point, probably over lunch or maybe after a couple of drinks, I'm not sure.
And it was a pleasure at Washington Lee to get to talk to both Sally Wyant and John Doyle, who were both there back then.
Yeah.
And then shortly after getting here, Darcy Kirk invited me to do a technology consult at Connecticut. And then I think about a year later, I got to work with Michael Slinger at Widener. And then a couple of years after that, I worked with Sarah Lee at Northeastern. All of these on helping them decide how best to organize their technology and also what kind of equipment might be appropriate for their environments.
Good. After this session goes on to Hein Online and theirs do, you're going to all be joining again as part of the oral history.
Good.
I'm pleased to be able to talk to all of them over the course, many of them over the course of this trip.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah. Well, Ken, you, in addition to all the consulting and other professional service, you're also a writer of articles and
Occasionally.
other professional literature contributions.
Occasionally.
Would you like to share any of that?
Sure. In terms of journal articles, my first journal article was a very nuts and bolts one back around '93, I think, when I did an article for LRSQ, Legal Reference Services Quarterly, on the on how to connect your LAN, local area network, to the internet, which to me seemed a worthwhile thing for folks to know.
It did turn out to be a worthwhile thing for folks to know about, yes.
And then, as I said, Wayne Miller and I co-wrote an article which was published in 2004, and it was actually a symposium from what was then called the Courtroom 21 Project at William and Mary, but it was published in the William and Mary Bill of Rights Journal, where we laid out how to go about teaching a legal technology class, and it turns out a lot of people have looked at that article and decided to implement some form of it in their institutions. And then most recently, not quite 2 years ago, Jim Millis and I had counterpoint public articles in Law Library Journal on whether academic law librarians would continue, or academic law libraries were doomed or not. And this is actually something we had first presented our argument about at the Cali conference 3 years ago in Chicago. Mm-hmm. And then it was published in Spectrum. And also for several, while I was, when the Computing Services Special Interest section had a newsletter. The original newsletter was called Automatome, and then when Liz Glankler, the late Liz Glankler of St. Louis University, was editing it, we renamed it and to Connections, and she was the editor, and I had a regular column in that, as well as then I had a regular column when I was chair of the section.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's not often I get to talk to a fairly recent leader in the association in terms of service on the executive board, but I've got one today, and I understand and I recall that there was this last year was one where you had some interesting
yes, we
had a very
controversial issue on renaming the association, and it's the recent past, so anybody viewing this in the near term won't need much reminding about it, but we proposed renaming, and when I say we, I mean the executive board, proposed renaming the association to the Legal Information Association, I believe. And there was a very spirited, primarily online discussion, and for some people we hit a nerve. But I always, the whole time, I felt that the discussion was very worthwhile. Mm-hmm. I was very happy to participate in it. I thought it really exposed how important a name and what people thought of the association was, and it let us see that there was a very strong difference of opinion, and I think that's brought us to a place where we're better. We both, when I say we, I'm now a former board member, but those who were governing the association and the membership as a whole can see what's important to people and hopefully work together to further the interests of the association and take steps to try to avoid the isolation of people by what they do.
Mm-hmm. Well, it was interesting. I had views on it as well. We have retired AELL group, a listserv, and we had an interesting but somewhat off the record discussion on that, pro and con on the issues. And what I really appreciated was it stayed civilized, and I suspect not all of the things you heard about were. Totally. And it was reasoned, and there were strong opinions one way or the other expressed, and I think we're still, well, nobody has quit my listserv over that, so I say mine, I'm the administrator, it's really mine.
Very good.
It's
Well,
ours.
I would much rather have people, strongly saying opinions about how they feel something should be than sitting back and then either never saying anything or not complaining until after the action had already been taken. I think there's nothing wrong with people vociferously, preferably politely, but occasionally I can understand. I myself on occasion get a little inflamed, and I think we all have to learn as adults to deal with that in as respectful a manner as we can.
You served with 3 presidents, Steve Henderson, Holly Rico, is it?
Yes.
And
Riccio, yes.
Riccio, and Keith Ann
Yes.
Staverson.
And I enjoyed.
What was that like?
They're each unique individuals, and I enjoyed all of them. And I especially appreciate their tolerance for me. I have since my junior high days been a stickler for parliamentary procedure, and so when I thought we were at a place on the board meeting where something wasn't quite going the way I thought it should, I spoke up, and they very graciously tolerated my constant interruptions and trying to guide them like Mr. Know-It-All.
Well, I think parliamentary procedure is designed to keep things moving along properly so that
Yes.
some resolution of the issues can be had.
And in fact, last I think November's issue of Spectrum, I did have a little article on how to run a meeting the Ken Hirsh way.
The Ken Hirsh way.
That's not the name of it, but frankly, that's what it comes down to.
Great. Well, maybe on that, we're probably getting close to the end of our conversation today, but before we do, it's customary for me to ask if there's anything that we've not talked about that you would like to mention.
Nothing other than, again, I first of all have to express gratitude for my wife, whose devotion to me and our children has surely, without that, there's no way I would have had the career I've had. And then along with her, I want to thank so many people along the way, some I've mentioned, but many more I haven't mentioned, whom I've either learned from or become great friends with, or both. And again, I wouldn't have as joyous a career if I hadn't met all these people.
Good. Well, maybe on that, I should thank you, Ken Hirsh, for being part of our conversation this afternoon and contributing all your story to our oral history of which collectively is the story of us as law librarian profession. And in thanking you, I'm thanking you on my behalf, of course, but also on behalf of Michelle Wu, Frank Hodek, and Dick Spinelli, with whom I have the pleasure of working to put together this oral history.
Well, it's been my pleasure, and thank you so much, Pat, for taking the time to meet with me.